Hi and welcome back to the Sword Study Series. I'm Nick Thomas at the Academy of Historical Fencing, and today we're going to be looking at a very beautiful British infantry officer's silver hallmark hilted sword from 1792. Now, how can I be so precise? Well, because the silver hallmarked hilt is datable to a precise year, and that's really lucky because normally we can only date a sword by to a degree manufacturer, which many swords of this period did not have manufacturers of them, and then down to the style, which can be vague. So yeah, 1792. So this is an infantry officer's sword, or infantry officer's spadroon. It loosely follows the 1786 regulation. I call it a regulation, not a pattern, because it wasn't a pattern at all. It was very loose. So in 1786, the first ever British infantry regulation came in, and all it called for was a 1-inch blade at the shoulder by 32-inch long and straight. And then the only hilt regulation was that the colour of the guard, the actual metalwork, had to match the uniform buttons of your uniform, and that's it. So there was no standardized grip, no standardized guard. There was so little standardization to the blade whatsoever, and as a result you can end up with commonly a single-edged fuller blade, or you can end up with, like this, a double-edged diamond section blade. They can be narrow, they can be wider, they can vary in weight and stiffness and all kinds of things, and the hilts can vary even more. But the most common form of guard under the 1786 regulations has just this very simple D shape. It's a form of stirrup guard that we usually call a D-shaped guard. And that's the most common. But then what happens here on the side, normally they have either nothing at all or they might have a single loop. This one actually has some really extra fancy detail and these kind of like swirly branches, which are just fancy, you know. This is a silver hilted spadroon, so why wouldn't it be fancy? Most commonly, these guards were just steel or brass. Silver is far more unusual. Right, what can I say about this? Okay, well, the guard, again, most spadroons, they have nothing on the inside. It's very rare to find a spadroon, unless it's double-shelled, of course. That's a symmetrical double-shell guard. But anything else, when they have just a stirrup guard, they usually only have stuff on the outside, even when they have additional branches here. Very rare is it to find a spadroon with anything on this side whatsoever when it's of this stirrup-type form. And you know, that is actually a compromise for this kind of sword. A spadroon is a mixed cut and thrust sword, and often it would be more thrust than cut, depending on the type of blade that you've got. This particular example, with a narrow diamond section blade, in many ways you could argue that this is more a small sword. You know, nobody ever said that the infantry regulations were a spadroon. We think of that in a modern context of, okay, the 1796 infantry sword is a spadroon. But no, the regulations generally call for a spadroon, but you can actually make it into different things. You can put a more of a small sword blade on it, or you can put a very beefy broadsword blade on it, because it's 1-inch minimum by 32, and the 32 can potentially be a minimum as well. So, you know, like for example, some of the Highlanders and the Scottish regiments, the Royal Scots, they put on big broadsword blades on their spadroon hilts, and it's not really a spadroon anymore. So you could argue in many ways that this is more a small sword, but the important thing is that it's an infantry officer's sword of the 1786 regulation, and we know because of the silver hallmark that it's from 1792. Now, spadroons typically had always carried, British spadroons had always used double shell guards right from when they became popular in the late 17th century all the way through most of the 18th century, and sometimes they had additional branches on the side, but they were essentially a double shell guard with a knuckle bow. And the 1796 is also that. But the 1786 in the middle, there was just this brief period when they went to a stirrup guard with maybe some outer protection. And that is not a very clever design to have on a spadroon when you want to do lots of thrust work. When you do lots of thrust work, you really want shells, like a small sword or a decent spadroon, to give protection from the front. But, you know, this sacrifices for fashion. Now, why would it sacrifice so much for fashion? Well, for a start, a sword spends most of its time in the scabbard on the side being worn, so it's much a fashion statement. And in the 1780s, the hussar fashions were raging. So the light cavalry sabres of the British were starting to adopt these D-shaped stirrup guards that were in use with the Austrians and the Hungarians and stuff like that. And it basically caught on to other swords, to hangers and to spadroons. So it was not at all the guard suited to spadroons, but it was fashionable, and therefore it got used. And what is this sword? A silver hilted spadroon. What is this if not fashionable? So yeah, most spadroons had brass or steel guards. Let's look at some specification. This spadroon weighs 512 grams. So when I said it was a lot like a small sword, I was not lying. I wasn't exaggerating. I have a small sword, an original, that is exactly that weight with this kind of handling characteristic. So with spadroons, with a double shell, sort of say 1796s, we'd expect them to be about 650 to 700 grams. You can be outside of that, but that's kind of typical. These D-shaped sort of 1786s are usually about 550 up to about 700, and even then that would be high. Usually 550 to 650, but this one down at 513. That's really light, and that's not surprising because the silver guard is thin and light, and the blade is a diamond-sectioned lightweight blade. So what you have here is an infantry officer's spadroon-looking sword that it does have edges, although you could debate whether they could actually deliver anything of note. They might still stop people grabbing it, and they might be able to slash exposed skin, but it's very much a kind of small sword that matches the army regulations for a spadroon. Okay, let's have a look at the balance. Balance is 11 centimeters. That's very typical for a spadroon. It's actually very typical for a small sword, and a great many swords actually in that period. And you find sabers within that range as well. So the balance isn't anything unusual. So you have a light blade and a light hilt. All of it combines into a very, very agile and nimble package, which is basically a small sword that has just, a bit of edge to it. Okay, right. Let's get on to some measurements. Let's look at the profile taper. 2.67 centimeters at the shoulder, ranging down to 1.74, and in the last sort of 10 to 15 it goes down to 1.35. So that's kind of what you'd expect on a diamond section blade. If we now look at the distal taper, this is where it gets a bit beastly. So it's 8.7 millimeters thick. So, I would expect to see that on a range of, say, meaty cavalry sabers, even some meaty infantry sabers. That is meaty for a sword that is otherwise all very, very light. And so what you've got here is a sword that's actually really strong in the fort. So if you wanted to parry away bayonets and stuff with this, despite its low weight, it would actually suit it quite well. It's fairly strong at this point. And then halfway along the blade, it's still 3.1. The last 10 centimeters or so is down to 2.2. So what you have is a blade that is very, very light and is very small sword-like, but here is really, really strong. So, it would be able to parry a lot of things. Okay, so I think we've about covered it. The only thing I would like to add at this point is the grip, which is unusual. Although when I say unusual, it's unusual for spadroons. It's actually very, very common for spadroons of this particular period. So the spadroons of the 1780s and early 1790s so commonly had this very hussar-inspired, light cavalry, saber-inspired guard. But they don't follow the grips usually. You will find some with back straps and asymmetric grips that are ergonomic grips like a saber of that time. But more commonly, you will find this very square-like grip. Now, it's not completely square, but what I mean is it's flat here and it's flat here. It does have still softened edges, and it always reminds me of some pole arms, like the halberd trainers we use are octagonal shafts. And when you soften off the edges, of course, on a square shape, you end up with very much an octagonal shape. And I've always found that to be really nice to hold, to grip. It's nice and firm. You can align the edges really, really well, but it's something that didn't really last. So you'll see this on spadroons of this particular period, and then when you get to 1796, they're all oval again. And most sword grips we think of as oval, even though certain ones might have a flat back for the thumb in certain time periods, although not so common in this period. I personally think that it was done for aesthetic reasons. I think it matches the hard angles of the D-shaped guard that's so common with the 1786s, where this rounded off later on, with the pillow-shaped pommel with these hard edges. I think it just suited the aesthetic of that particular time period. But as a byproduct, it actually handles really, really nicely. You can't actually put the thumb up on many 1796 Spadroons because they're kind of sharpish there. You have to basically grip them with the thumb more on the side. So this square grip, not only does it allow great purchase with the thumb, it also allows just a really good grip and control with all the other fingers. And so I've always felt these square grips, you can just get some amazing point control and edge alignment and stuff with them. So I actually really, really like these kind of squared grips, and I'd like to use them more personally myself, even though in Spadroon terms and most sword terms, they were not very common. And there you have it. So there you have a British Infantry Officer Spadroon from 1792. This regulation type of Spadroon went out of use in 1796, although again, they weren't necessarily immediately replaced, and they might have served on. We know they served on with certain militia and volunteer units up until around 1800 or just a year or two afterwards. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe if you haven't already.